May 24, 1941, dawned with a cold gray light over the Denmark Strait, but for the 1,415 men aboard the HMS Hood, it was the last sunrise they would ever witness, because a single 15-inch shell from the German battleship Bismarck had just pierced their deck and detonated the aft magazines with the force of a small volcano. This catastrophic explosion did more than just sink the pride of the Royal Navy in less than 10 minutes. It shattered the illusion of British naval invincibility and sent a shockwave of terror and fury through the halls of Westminster, forcing Winston Churchill to issue the most desperate command of his career. The sinking of the Hood was the spark that ignited the greatest naval manhunt in history, a 3-day pursuit across the unforgiving Atlantic that would eventually force Adolf Hitler to confront the terrifying reality that his most expensive toy was nothing more than a 50,000-ton coffin. The genesis of this disaster began long before the first shot was fired, rooted in the map room of the Reich Chancellery, where Hitler stood staring at a meticulously crafted model of the Bismarck with a mixture of awe and possessive pride. This vessel was the ultimate expression of German engineering, a mountain of steel protected by armor thick enough to shrug off the heaviest salvos the British could offer, and armed with 8 15-inch guns that could hurl 2,000-pound projectiles over the horizon with deadly precision. Hitler viewed the Bismarck not merely as a weapon of war, but as a psychological bludgeon to break the spirit of the British Empire, believing that its mere presence in the Atlantic would terrorize merchant sailors and starve the United Kingdom into a shameful submission. However, the Naval High Command, led by Admiral Erich Raeder, understood a truth that Hitler chose to ignore. The Bismarck was a lonely titan, a massive investment of resources that lacked the necessary support of a balanced fleet. Admiral Günther Lütjens, the man chosen to lead Operation Rheinübung, was a career officer with an iron face and a soul tempered by decades of naval tradition. Yet even he felt the weight of impending doom as he prepared the Bismarck to sail from Gotenhofen on May 18, 1941. Lütjens had argued for a delay because the Bismarck's sister ship, the Tirpitz, was not yet ready for combat, and the heavy cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were trapped in port under constant repair from British air raids. He knew that taking the world's most powerful battleship into the North Atlantic, with only the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen as an escort, was a monumental gamble that placed the entire future of the German surface fleet on a single roll of the dice. But Hitler was a man who demanded results and possessed no patience for the cautious calculations of admirals, believing instead that German will and superior technology would inevitably overcome the numerical superiority of the Royal Navy. As the Bismarck slipped out of the Baltic and began its silent trek through the Norwegian fjords, the atmosphere on the bridge was a suffocating mix of professional discipline and quiet apprehension, while Lütjens watched the coastline of the Third Reich fade into the mist. They stopped briefly at Bergen to refuel, a move that proved to be a critical tactical error because it allowed British reconnaissance aircraft to spot the gray giants nestled within the jagged cliffs of the fjord. The moment the report reached Admiral John Tovey at the British Home Fleet headquarters, the mechanical gears of the Royal Navy began to turn with a relentless, grinding efficiency that sought to trap the German raiders before they could vanish into the vast expanses of the open ocean. Tovey ordered every available ship, from the massive battleships King George V and Prince of Wales to the smallest destroyers, to converge on the gaps between Scotland, Iceland, and Greenland. The British knew that if the Bismarck reached the Atlantic convoy routes, it could slaughter the merchant ships that served as Britain's lifeblood, effectively winning the war for Germany without a single tank crossing the English Channel. On the evening of May 23rd, the cruiser HMS Suffolk was patrolling the narrow, ice-clogged waters of the Denmark Strait when its radar screen flickered with a massive contact, signaling that the hunt had truly begun. Lütjens was immediately aware that he had been spotted, but he faced a harrowing choice between turning back to Germany in a move that would satisfy his strategic caution or pushing forward into the unknown to fulfill the aggressive mandates of his Führer. He chose to push forward, trusting in the thick steel of his hull and the skill of his gunners to smash through whatever obstacles the British threw in his path, unaware that he was sailing directly into a confrontation that would define his legacy and seal his fate. The engagement on the morning of May 24th was brief, violent, and utterly lopsided as the HMS Hood and the newly commissioned Prince of Wales attempted to intercept the German duo at high speed. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, commanding from the bridge of the Hood, sought to close the range quickly to protect his ship's vulnerable deck armor, but the Bismarck's gunnery officer, Adalbert Schneider, found the range with terrifying speed. When the Bismarck's fifth salvo straddled the hood, a single shell found its way into the ship's vitals, triggering an explosion so massive that it rose 1,000 feet into the air and snapped the largest warship in the world in half like a dry twig. On the Bismarck, the crew erupted in cheers as they watched their primary rival vanish beneath the waves in a matter of seconds, leaving only 3 survivors from a crew of over 1,400 men. But the celebration on the German battleship was premature because the Prince of Wales, despite being plagued by mechanical failures and sustaining multiple hits, had managed to strike the Bismarck 3 times before turning away under a smokescreen. One of those shells had penetrated the Bismarck's bow, rupturing fuel tanks and causing a heavy leak that trailed a dark, shimmering slick of oil across the white-capped waves of the Atlantic. This was the turning point of the entire operation, as the unsinkable ship was now wounded, its range limited, and its position easily trackable by any pursuing vessel that could follow the scent of its leaking lifeblood. Lütjens realized that the mission to raid convoys was over before it had even begun, and he made the fateful decision to detach the Prince Eugen and steer the Bismarck toward the safety of the French coast and the port of Brest. In London, the news of the Hood's destruction was met with a stunned, icy silence that quickly transformed into a cold, murderous resolve as Winston Churchill issued his famous 3-word directive: sink the Bismarck. This was no longer just a naval engagement. It was a matter of national survival and imperial prestige that required the Royal Navy to abandon all other duties, including the protection of vital convoys, to ensure the German monster did not reach safety. Admiral Tovey pushed his ships to their absolute limits, burning through coal and oil as they raced to intercept the Bismarck before it could come under the protection of German U-boats and the Luftwaffe based in the occupied France. The ocean became a chessboard where the British moved every piece they possessed, from the battleship Rodney to the aircraft carrier Victorious, in a desperate attempt to checkmate the German king. The pursuit grew increasingly desperate as the weather in the North Atlantic deteriorated, with heavy seas and low clouds providing a natural shroud for the fleeing Bismarck, while British radar struggled to maintain a lock. At 11:00 p.m. on May 24th, 9 Swordfish biplanes from the Victorious launched a daring attack through the failing light, their fabric-covered wings wobbling in the gale as they dropped torpedoes toward the twisting German hull. One torpedo struck the Bismarck amidships, but the heavy armor belt easily absorbed the blow, causing minimal damage, but rattling the nerves of Lütjens and his command staff. They realized the British were willing to use every obsolete aircraft and every outmatched ship in their inventory to slow them down, creating a psychological pressure that began to erode the confidence of the German sailors who had so recently tasted victory. During the early hours of May 25th, Lütjens managed to perform a brilliant tactical maneuver, executing a sharp turn and maintaining radio silence that caused the pursuing British cruisers to lose their radar contact completely. For 31 agonizing hours, the Bismarck was a ghost on the water, and the British commanders grew frantic as they searched thousands of square miles of empty ocean while their fuel supplies dwindled to dangerous levels. Tovey feared that the Bismarck had already slipped past them, and a sense of gloom began to settle over the British Admiralty as they contemplated the possibility that the killer of the Hood would escape unpunished. However, Lütjens committed a monumental blunder by breaking radio silence to send a long, detailed transmission to Berlin, mistakenly believing that the British still had him on radar and that a report to his superiors was necessary. British direction-finding stations on land picked up the signal and triangulated the Bismarck's position, giving the Royal Navy one final chance to close the trap before the German battleship reached the safety umbrella of the French coast. The window of opportunity was closing fast, as the Bismarck was only hundreds of miles from Brest, and the British battleships were running so low on fuel that they would soon be forced to abandon the chase. The only force close enough to intervene was Force H, steaming up from Gibraltar, which included the aircraft carrier Ark Royal and the battlecruiser Renown. The fate of the entire pursuit now rested on the shoulders of the pilots of the Ark Royal's Swordfish squadron, men flying aircraft that looked like relics of a previous war, but carried the only weapons capable of stopping a 50,000-ton behemoth. At 3:00 p.m. on May 26, 15 Swordfish took off from the pitching deck of the Ark Royal into a wall of mist and rain, searching for the Bismarck in a sea that was rising in mountainous swells. In their first attempt, they accidentally attacked the British cruiser Sheffield, which was shadowing the Bismarck, but fortunately their new magnetic detonators failed to explode, allowing the pilots to return to the carrier, rearm with contact fuses, and try one last time. This final strike, launched at 7:00 p.m., was the most critical moment of the entire naval war, because if they failed, the Bismarck would be under the protection of German land-based bombers by dawn. The pilots flew at wave-top height, barely 100 miles per hour, as they braved a storm of anti-aircraft fire that lit up the darkening sky like a macabre firework display. 2 torpedoes found their mark, but the first hit the Bismarck's main armor belt and did nothing more than shake the ship, leaving the crew hopeful that they would still reach France by morning. But the second torpedo struck the very rear of the ship, an area where the armor was thin and the vital steering machinery was located, causing a catastrophic jam of the twin rudders at a 40-degree angle to port. Just like that, the world's most powerful battleship was transformed into a giant, helpless top, incapable of steering a straight course, and forced to turn in slow, agonizing circles toward its approaching executioners. The engineers worked frantically below decks, even considering the use of explosives to blow the rudders off, but the heavy seas made any repair impossible, leaving Lütjens with the grim realization that his journey was over. At midnight, Lütjens sent a final, chilling message to the Naval High Command in Berlin, stating that the ship was unmaneuverable and that they would fight to the last shell for the glory of the Führer. In Berlin, the message reached Admiral Raeder, who was forced to wake Hitler and deliver the news that the pride of the Kriegsmarine was a sitting duck in the middle of the Atlantic. Hitler's reaction was one of white-hot fury and disbelief as he paced his study and demanded to know how an unsinkable ship could be crippled by a group of obsolete biplanes. He had been promised a symbol of German dominance, but instead he was being presented with a humiliating failure that threatened to undermine his entire naval strategy before the invasion of the Soviet Union had even begun. The night of May 26 was a long, cold vigil for the crew of the Bismarck, who stood at their action stations for the 3rd straight day, watching the shadows of British destroyers darting through the waves just out of range. They knew that the dawn would bring the heavy guns of the British home fleet and that there was no hope of rescue from U-boats or aircraft in such a violent storm. Captain Ernst Lindemann tried to maintain morale, but the sight of the ship's wake constantly curving back on itself was a constant reminder of their mortality. As the sun began to rise on May 27, the silhouettes of the HMS Rodney and King George V appeared on the horizon, their massive silhouettes signaling the end of the hunt and the beginning of the slaughter. The British battleships opened fire at 8:47 a.m., their 16-inch and 14-inch shells arcing through the air to fall like hammer blows on the Bismarck superstructure. For the first few minutes, the German gunners returned fire with their usual precision, nearly hitting the Rodney, but the lack of a stable platform and the sheer volume of British fire soon took their toll. A shell from the Rodney's 3rd salvo struck the Bismarck's forward turrets, silencing half of its main armament in an instant and turning the pride of the German fleet into a flaming wreck. The British closed the range to point blank, firing until their gun barrels were hot, and the Bismarck was nothing more than a blackened hulk of twisted steel. Yet the ship refused to sink, its thick armor belt holding the sea at bay, even as its crew died by the hundreds. The devastation aboard the Bismarck was not merely a matter of structural damage, but a systematic dismantling of a floating fortress by the overwhelming, concentrated fury of the Royal Navy's home fleet. As the Rodney and King George V continued their relentless bombardment, closing the range to an impossible 3,000 yards, the shells began to penetrate the upper works with horrific frequency, turning the once pristine decks into a slaughterhouse of jagged steel and fire. Admiral Tovey, watching from his flagship, knew that the Bismarck was finished as a fighting unit, but the sheer resilience of German armor meant that despite firing over 700 shells from the King George V and nearly 400 from the Rodney, the hull remained stubbornly buoyant even as the superstructure was reduced to a flaming, unrecognizable hulk. One particularly devastating salvo from the Rodney's 16-inch guns struck the Bismarck's forward command center, effectively decapitating the ship's leadership in a single heartbeat and killing Admiral Lütjens alongside most of his senior staff while they remained at their posts. With the bridge destroyed and the main battery silenced, The interior of the Bismarck became a hellish landscape of smoke, ruptured steam pipes, and the screams of men trapped in the darkness below the waterline. Captain Ernst Lindemann, the ship's commander, reportedly stayed with his vessel until the very end, witnessing the total collapse of his command as the British ships circled like wolves around a dying stag, pouring fire into the burning wreck at point-blank range. By 10:15 in the morning, the Bismarck was a drifting furnace, yet its thick belt of Krupp-cemented armor continued to protect its vitals, preventing the British shells from reaching the magazines or engine rooms to deliver the final explosive coup de grace. Admiral Tovey, now desperately low on fuel himself, realized that he could not wait for the ship to sink from gunfire alone, and ordered the cruiser Dorsetshire to move in and finish the job with torpedoes, while the surviving German crew members began to realize that their only options were to drown or take matters into their own hands. The decision to scuttle the Bismarck was born from a final defiant tradition of the German Navy, as engineering parties deep within the bowels of the ship ignored the chaos above to set explosive charges and open the seacocks, ensuring the British would never capture their prize. As the seawater began to rush into the engine rooms, the Dorsetshire fired 3 torpedoes into the Bismarck's shattered flanks, but the ship was already settling by the bow due to the actions of its own crew. At 10:36 in the morning, the massive battleship began its final plunge, the bow sliding beneath the churning Atlantic while the stern rose high into the air, revealing the massive propellers still spinning uselessly in the cold morning mist before the entire 50,000-ton structure slipped forever beneath the waves. Hundreds of German sailors were left bobbing in the freezing, oil-slicked water, clinging to debris and calling out for rescue as the British ships cautiously approached to pick up survivors. The rescue operation was a brief moment of humanity in the midst of total war, but it was tragically cut short when a lookout on the Dorsetshire reported a suspected U-boat periscope, triggering a panic that forced the British ships to abandon the scene immediately. Because of this false alarm, hundreds of German sailors who had survived the battle were left behind to perish in the frigid North Atlantic, resulting in a staggering loss of life, where only 110 men were saved out of a total crew of over 2,200. The news of the Bismarck's destruction reached Berlin that same afternoon, creating an atmosphere of funereal gloom within the Ministry of Propaganda, which had only days earlier been trumpeting the sinking of the Hood as proof of German naval supremacy. Admiral Raeder was tasked with the unenviable duty of informing the Führer that his greatest battleship had been hunted down and destroyed in just 3 days of operations, a report that he knew would shatter Hitler's confidence in the surface fleet forever. When Raeder finally delivered the report, Hitler's reaction was not one of immediate explosive rage, but a chilling, cold silence as he listened to the details of the jammed rudder and the final lopsided battle against the British home fleet. According to eyewitness accounts, the Führer eventually erupted, pacing his study and declaring that the surface fleet was a monumental waste of steel and manpower that could have been better utilized building tanks for the impending invasion of the Soviet Union. He mocked the idea of unsinkable ships and pointed out with bitter precision that the British would always have 100 ships for every one the Germans could produce, rendering grand surface sorties a pointless gesture that only resulted in humiliating losses. This moment marked a fundamental shift in Hitler's psychological approach to naval warfare, moving away from the prestige of the battleship and toward the hidden, predatory world of the U-boat. Admiral Raeder tried to defend his strategy, arguing that the presence of heavy ships like the Tirpitz and the Scharnhorst still forced the British to tie down enormous resources to guard against potential breakouts. But Hitler was no longer interested in strategic nuances. The Führer issued a direct order that no further offensive operations were to be undertaken by the heavy surface units without his express permission, effectively turning the remains of the Kriegsmarine into a Fliegenbeing that would rot in the fjords of Norway. He wanted the ships to remain as a threat that never materialized, a psychological burden for the British that would not risk the catastrophic loss of another capital ship or the embarrassment of another public defeat. This policy of caution would eventually lead to the resignation of Raeder in 1943, paving the way for Karl Donitz and his wolf packs to take total control of German naval destiny. The personal fury Hitler felt toward the Bismarck's loss was rooted in his pathological hatred of being proven wrong, especially since he had overruled Lütjens' initial concerns about sailing without adequate air or sea support. He obsessed over the details of the engagement, repeatedly asking how a group of obsolete biplanes could cripple the most modern warship in the world. Yet he refused to learn the primary lesson that the era of the battleship had been eclipsed by the aircraft carrier. Instead of investing in naval aviation or carrier construction, he doubled down on his belief that the war would be decided on the vast plains of Russia, viewing the sea as an alien and uncontrollable environment that belonged exclusively to the British. This land-centric focus would define the remaining 4 years of the war, as the German surface fleet became a draining asset that consumed resources and sailors without ever delivering a decisive blow to the Allied cause. In the weeks following the sinking, the German propaganda machine worked feverishly to spin the disaster as a heroic sacrifice, claiming that the Bismarck had fought against overwhelming odds to achieve a moral victory for the Reich. But behind the closed doors of the Chancellery, the atmosphere was one of mutual distrust between Hitler and his naval advisors, as the Führer began to micromanage every aspect of naval deployments with a rigid, fearful control. He questioned every tactical choice Lütjens had made, from the failure to finish off the Prince of Wales to the decision to continue toward France instead of turning back to the safety of Norway after being spotted. This lack of trust meant that German naval commanders would henceforth be paralyzed by the fear of Hitler's disapproval, often missing opportunities to strike because they were too afraid of losing another precious hull. The strategic consequence of the Bismarck's loss was the total surrender of the Atlantic surface to the Royal Navy, allowing Churchill to focus his resources on the Mediterranean and the vital convoy routes that would eventually support the invasion of Europe. While the Tirpitz would continue to menace Arctic convoys from its Norwegian hideouts, it never achieved the terrifying potential that Hitler had once envisioned for his battleship fleet. The Bismarck itself became a ghost of the deep, resting 3 miles down on the slopes of an undersea volcano, a broken monument to the limits of technological hubris and the enduring power of naval determination. Hitler never again expressed pride in his great ships, eventually ordering the decommissioning of the entire surface fleet in 1942 after the failure of the Battle of the Barents Sea, a decision that Raeder fought against until his final day in office. The 3 days in May 1941 changed the course of the naval war by convincing Hitler that the sea was a realm of unpredictable risk that Germany could not afford to play in. He turned his eyes toward the east, launching Operation Barbarossa just 5 weeks after the Bismarck slipped beneath the waves, seeking a victory on land that would compensate for his failure on the water. This shift in focus meant that the German Navy would never receive the carriers or the balanced fleet it needed to actually challenge British sea power, ensuring that the Allied lifeline across the Atlantic would remain open despite the best efforts of the U-boat fleet. The Bismarck's legacy is one of a magnificent weapon that was destroyed not just by British steel, but by a strategic vision that was as flawed as the rudder that ultimately doomed it. Even years later, the shadow of the Bismarck continued to haunt the German High Command, as every loss at sea was compared back to that fateful May morning. The unsinkable ship became a cautionary tale of how a single lucky hit could derail the grandest of military plans, reinforcing Hitler's belief that only land warfare offered the control and certainty he craved. The ship's destruction was the moment the Third Reich realized that the Royal Navy, despite its aging ships and global commitments, still possessed a lethality and a will to win that German technology could not easily overcome. It was a realization that Hitler spent the rest of his life trying to suppress through micromanagement and redirected aggression. Yet the truth remained at the bottom of the Atlantic. The men who died aboard the Bismarck, including Admiral Lütjens and Captain Lindemann, were victims of a strategy that sent them into the lion's den without the necessary support to survive. Their bravery was undeniable, but it was spent on a mission that was strategically bankrupt from the moment the first British reconnaissance plane spotted them in Bergen. The Royal Navy's pursuit was a masterclass in coordination and persistence, showing that sea power is not just about the strength of a single ship, but about the ability to command the vast reaches of the ocean through communication, logistics, and air power. The Bismarck story is the final chapter in the age of the battleship, a time when a single great vessel could capture the imagination of a nation, only to be brought low by a changing world it wasn't prepared to face. As the war progressed, the resources that could have been used to build a modern navy were instead fed into the insatiable maw of the Eastern Front, leaving the Kriegsmarine as a secondary service that could only watch as the Allies built an armada of thousands. Hitler's refusal to adapt to the carrier age ensured that his ships would always be vulnerable, just as the Bismarck had been when those Swordfish biplanes came wobbling through the mist. The sinking was more than a military victory for Britain. It was a psychological triumph that validated Churchill's leadership and provided a much-needed boost to a nation that had been standing alone against the Nazi tide. The Bismarck remains one of the most famous ships in history, not for what it achieved, but for the dramatic three-day saga of its birth, its triumph, and its tragic, inevitable destruction. In the end, the Bismarck lies in the eternal dark, its massive turrets fallen away, and its hull torn by the impact with the seabed, serving as a silent witness to a war that was lost at sea as much as it was on land. The swastikas painted on its deck for aerial identification are slowly being consumed by the ocean, just as the ideology they represented was consumed by the forces it unleashed upon the world. Hitler's dream of a German global empire was sunk along with the Bismarck, leaving behind only the wreckage of a fleet and the memory of a three-day hunt that defined the limits of his power. The sea belongs to the British, he had said, and in the cold light of May 27, 1941, the Bismarck proved him right. The legacy of the Bismarck is a testament to the fact that in modern warfare, no single weapon, no matter how advanced, is truly unsinkable when faced with a determined and resourceful enemy. The story of its final hours, from the destruction of the Hood to the scuttling in the Atlantic, remains one of the most compelling narratives of the 20th century, a cinematic tragedy of hubris, courage, and the crushing weight of history. As we look back on those 3 days in May, we see the moment when the tide began to turn, not in a grand land battle, but in the spray and steel of the North Atlantic. The Bismarck was a titan, but it was a titan built for a war that was already passing it by, leaving it to face the future alone in the dark. If you were in Admiral Lütjens' position after the Bismarck was spotted in the Denmark Strait, would you have pushed forward into the Atlantic or turned back to the safety of Norway to save your ship? Let us know your strategic choice in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.